Ruth and, oh, we're recording. Got it. Ruth and her husband Elimelech and their two sons, let's see, Mahlon and Chilion, leave Bethlehem as a full family. Everybody dies except for Naomi and her daughters-in-law. Naomi and one of her daughters-in-law, Ruth, returned to Bethlehem. They left full, they come back empty, despairing and having no hope for one reason. The Lord's hand has turned against Naomi. She is sure of it. There is no other explanation. Naomi knows for a fact that God's hand has turned against her because she left as a family and returned as an unfamily. And so she's changing her name from sweet to bitter. And so that's how they come back to Bethlehem. Ruth realizes, hey, we're going to need some food tonight. And so she goes to somebody's field during the day, happens to make her way to the field of a man named Boaz. Boaz, as it turns out, is a distant relative of Naomi, a distant relative of Elimelech. Boaz treats her with extraordinary kindness and generosity. Ruth left her house that morning empty-handed with no food. She returns that night, having been fully satisfied at lunch and with enough food for the next month. You hear this theme of leaving empty, returning full, leaving full, returning empty, leaving empty, returning full. And she comes home that night, and Naomi says, well, hey, who did all of this for you? And Ruth says, his name, I think, was Boaz. And Naomi recognizes instantly, this is a family member of my dead husband. And so she gives Ruth the Reba McEntire treatment, sends Ruth back to Boaz's tent that night, and says, ask Boaz to be your next of kin, is the way our Bible translates it. What she's really asking is, ask Boaz to be your Goel, your kinsman redeemer. The kinsman redeemer was the closest male relative whose responsibility was to care for any member of the family who had been lost due to life's crippling circumstances. For instance, two widows who are outside of the family unit, which is the primary unit of protection and provision in Israel. Boaz receives this question from Ruth, rightly sees that Ruth isn't asking for sex. Ruth is asking for Boaz to be who God made him to be, the kinsman redeemer. Boaz responds, of course I will do this for you, and sends her home with even more food and protects her reputation, right? That whole scene takes place at night. Boaz sends her home in the pre-dawn light so that nobody sees her leaving the threshing floor with a man. And so he's protecting Ruth from beginning to end, and says, all right, go home, and tomorrow we'll make it official. So the only question remaining for us as we approach chapter 4 is, will Boaz do what he said he would do? Will Boaz fulfill his promise to be the Goel? Will Boaz fulfill his promise to be the kinsman redeemer for Ruth and Naomi and secure their protection and provision moving into the future? So with all that said, let's dive into chapter 4. If you want to follow along, you can do that. Or if you want to, we've got the words on the screen. No sooner had Boaz gone up to the gate and sat down there that the next of kin, of whom Boaz had spoken, came passing by. So Boaz said, come over, friend, sit down here. And he went over and sat down. Then Boaz took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, sit down here. And so they sat down. One of the pieces that we were moving so quickly through at the end of last week is that at the end of chapter 3, Boaz says, all right, look, tomorrow we're going to make it official. The thing is, there's actually a closer living male relative that could be your Goel. So he says, tomorrow we're going to see if he will be your Goel, your kinsman redeemer. Great. You will have a kinsman redeemer. If he will not be your kinsman redeemer, then I will do it. So chapter 4 opens the next day. We find this other kinsman redeemer who's not even given the dignity of a name. That ought to tip you off that this isn't going to go well for the other guy. So Boaz sees him and says, hey, friends, come and have a seat. He gathers 10 elders. This is a standard legal proceeding, right? Remember, you don't have courts of law. You don't have, legal contracts that you're going to sign. That's not how the world worked. You would gather 10 men, 10 of the elders of the city, gather them together so that you have witnesses for this verbal exchange about who's going to do what and when. And so Boaz, gathers them at the city gate and is going to ask the Goel, this other guy, to step up to the plate. So verse 3, he said to the next of kin, to the Goel, Naomi has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our kinsman Elimelech. So I thought I'd tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you won't, tell me so that I may know, for there's no one prior to you to redeem it, and I come after you. He's just laying out the case. Hey, there's this piece of property that is available. Now he's talking about the land that belonged to Elimelech. Notice what he's left out. What did he leave out? Naomi and Ruth. Interesting on the setup there. I like the setup. Hey, buddy, I got a deal for you that is so good. There's this piece of land. She's a real beaut. The land's a real beaut. And so he says, hey, if you want it, it's yours. If not, let me know and I'll take it. The next verse, I'll take it. Verse 4. Oh, what a great guy. Thanks, Boaz. I will redeem it. I do want it. It's cheap land. It will add to my wealth. It will add to my prosperity. It will add to the inheritance that I will pass on to my children. But there's a catch in verse 5. Boaz said that, hey, the day that you acquire the field from the hand of Naomi, you're also acquiring Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead man, to maintain the dead man's name on his inheritance. And the guy says, I can't do that. That's a little too pricey for my blood. He says, I can't redeem it without damaging my own inheritance. And now you see why this guy doesn't deserve a name in the text. Because he wanted the land, which was inexpensive. He doesn't want the responsibility. Right? Boaz, everybody in the scenario knows what it means to take on Ruth and Naomi. It's not just providing food for these extra two women. It is also providing an heir for Elimelech, an heir for Mahlon. Or is it Chilion? Who was married to Ruth? Anyways, whichever one was married to Ruth. So that means that if he takes on this responsibility, he now is not only feeding and protecting more people, he's having to divide his own inheritance among more people. This is a costly endeavor for this other Goel. And he says, yeah, I'm not willing to pay the price here. I'm not willing to fulfill my responsibility. I'm not willing to sacrifice for the sake of securing the future of these two women who have no other options. We just want to be clear. This guy has been presented with the opportunity to redeem the people around him, and he said, nope, too much for me. It's the cautionary tale in this story for us, because every last one of us is going to be, if you haven't already, presented with this exact scenario. Now, look, nobody's going to ask you to marry their dead son's wife while you're still married. But all of us have been or will be asked to do something expensive for the sake of securing the future of somebody around us. I mean, both eternally and temporally, right? We are asked to be sacrificial in the way that we follow Jesus. And so we know it will be costly. There's not a thing that is considered sacrificial and cheap. That piece doesn't exist. If it's sacrificial, it's going to be costly. That's why it's called a sacrifice. This guy's unwilling to step up to the plate. because he's worried about Ruth producing too many more kids, or maybe he just doesn't want to be associated with a Moabite. Either way. So there's the catch. Now the question is, what will Boaz do? So in verse 7, now this was the custom. Did I skip a piece? Did I get all the way to the end? He says, take my right of redemption for yourself, for I cannot redeem it. Yeah, verse 7. Now this was the custom in the former times of Israel concerning redeeming. Also a great reminder that this language of redemption doesn't come from Jesus. Jesus doesn't invent the language of redemption. In fact, Israel doesn't invent the language of redemption. The language of redemption is a cultural concept that God says, hey, here's a great image for what I'm doing for you. And we see it play out in this story. It's also one of the great ways of understanding what Jesus does for us. But this is the custom in the former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, the one took off a sandal and gave it to the other. This was the manner of attesting in Israel. You're not signing a document. There's no notary public. You're going to trade sandals. But just the one. You're going to have some mismatched sandals. Don't worry about it. I couldn't tell you what that's about. I have no idea. I don't know why that's the way of attesting in Israel, but I sure appreciate the explanatory note. It tells you that whoever's writing this is intending it to be read pretty broadly, pretty widely, because we need to explain how contracts are made how contracts of this type are made at this time in Israel. So when the next of kin said to Boaz, acquire it for yourself, he took off his sandal. And then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, today you are witnesses that I have acquired the land, that I have acquired from the hand of Naomi, all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and Mahlon. I've also acquired Ruth the Moabite, the wife of Mahlon, there you go, to be my wife, to maintain the dead man's name on his inheritance, in order that the name of the dead may not be cut off from his kindred and from the gate of his native place. Today, you are witnesses. Strange way of sealing the deal, but at the end of the day, we're approaching the climax of the story, and what we hear is that Boaz receives Ruth and Naomi into his Beitab, into his family, and that includes all of the rights and privileges of protection and provision and shelter and food and future. Right? Today, hope has been restored and secured for both Naomi and for Ruth. I think one of the questions that's good for us to consider, I'll invite you to think about it later, is it says today we're all witnesses. What are we witnesses of today? What in this story, what are we actually witnessing? You can talk about it at your tables, but I want you to think about this. We're witnessing more than just a contract. We're witnessing the story of how God works in the world. Today we are witnesses, and we see clearly what is happening in our midst. It's worth thinking about what actually happened in this story and how that informs the way we see God's work in our own world. All right, today we're witnesses. We'll move on to verse 11. Then all the people who were at the gate, along with the elders, said, we are witnesses. We see, we see, we see, we see. The community is seeing what Boaz is doing for Ruth and Naomi, and there is something compelling and powerful about it. It's not just that Boaz is fulfilling his obligation. The other Goel had the same obligation that Boaz had and refused to fulfill it. He's not arrested. He's not shamed. He's not put in jail. He had the right to refuse to do what God commanded him to do. And he did. Boaz, on the other hand, same obligation, same opportunity, accepts that responsibility. We're witnesses, we're witnesses, we're witnesses, we're witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. Anybody remember who Rachel and Leah are? Anybody? Rachel and Leah? What's that? Isaac. Yeah. Isaac's wives. Do you remember the story of Isaac going to work for his, what's that? Oh, Isaac and Rebecca. Jacob and Rachel and Leah. Thank you. Whoever said that. I didn't see who said it. Raise your hand, whoever's knowing all of the answers. Andy. Oh, it's Andy. You don't count. Yeah. He cheated. He Googled it. All right. So Jacob, yes, Jacob goes off and wants to marry this pretty lady. And her father says, work for me 7 years and I'll give her to you in marriage. And he ends up marrying the wrong chick. And his father-in-law says, hey, work for me 7 more years. I'll give you the one you wanted. I mean, there's a lot in that story that we are not going to deal with, bigamy. So do you remember who the children of Rachel and Leah were? Remember the children of Rachel and Leah? Anybody? Andy, don't Google it again. The children of Rachel and Leah are the heads of the 12 tribes of Israel. So when these witnesses say, may the Lord make the woman who's coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel, they're pronouncing the richest of blessings. Right? That doesn't change the meaning of the story necessarily, but notice how deep the blessing runs. May your house be like the house that built Israel, which is fascinating because, hold on to it, his house is going to be the house that builds Israel. Just not quite in the same way. So hold on to that image. May you produce children in Ephrathah and bestow a name in Bethlehem. That is going to happen. You'll see how in just a moment. And through the children that the Lord will give you by this young woman, may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. Now, what a treat. Phil is preaching this text on Sunday morning. Might I commend to you the story of Perez, Tamar, and Judah. It is just a light treat of a story in which Tamar marries Judah's oldest husband and he dies. And so Tamar marries Judah's second son and he dies. And Judah, having only 3 sons, operating on the Levirate laws, the same laws that are dictating Boaz's marriage to Ruth, by the way, Judah looks at this and says, you know, I've only got the one more son, and you didn't do so good with the first 2. So how about if we just hold on a minute, and leaves Tamar, a widow, on the outside looking in, waiting for the day, hopefully, that Judah will give his 3rd son to her so that her future might be secured, so that Judah's heirs might be born. And Judah doesn't do it. His 3rd son grows up, and Judah doesn't give him to Tamar as a husband to bear children for her dead husbands. The story's already a little tricky. So what do you think Tamar does? Tamar hears that Judah's going to another town and puts a cover over her face and dresses up like a prostitute. This is the Bible talking, not me. And Judah strolls up and says, well, hey, how you doing? And says, I'm just going to quote from the Bible for a moment. He says, can I come into you? And she says, well, sure, but what will you give me? And he says, a goat. And she says, okay, But how will I know that you're going to give me the goat? Because people don't carry their goats with them on their way into the whorehouse. He says, well, I'll give you my staff, my ring, and one other thing. I can't remember maybe my robe, something like that. And she says, okay. And so they consummate the relationship, so to speak. She conceives, and 3 months later, he doesn't know who she is because her face is covered, as one does. And 3 months later, she is evidently pregnant. They drag her before Judah and say, your daughter-in-law, I'm quoting from the Bible, has played the whore, and in her whoredom has become pregnant. And Judah says, bring her out, we're going to burn her. And she says, hey, Judah, the one who impregnated me owns this signet ring and this staff. And Judah, to his credit, says, you know what? She's been more righteous than me because I'm the one who did not fulfill my responsibility. Judah knows it was his responsibility to care for the widow in his family, and he didn't do it. And he knows that she shouldn't be burned at the stake. Far from it. Her future should be secure. So that's a bit of an aside. No, Chris, we're not taking questions. No. No, dear God, no. Did she get the goat? Did she get the goat? She got more than the goat. She got more than the goat. Let's see. Back to verse 12. Through the children that the Lord will give you by this young woman, may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. What a great callback to another situation in Scripture, in Israel's history, in which the Levirate laws were used, albeit a little tricky, to secure the future of the promise. That's what's secured in this story. It's not just Tamar's life. It's the future of the promise that God is making with Israel. Because ultimately, Perez, who's the child of Tamar, becomes the father of Hezron. Hezron's the father of Ram. Ram's the father of Abinadab. Aminadab is the father of Nahshon. Nahshon's the father of Salmon. Salmon is the father of Boaz. It all comes full circle. All right, we're moving quickly now towards the conclusion here. Verse 13, so Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When they came together, the Lord made her conceive, and she bore a son. And then the woman said to Naomi, blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without next of kin, without a kinsman redeemer. And may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you is more to you than 7 sons has borne him. And then Naomi took the child and laid him in her bosom and became his nurse. That's an odd part of the story. I don't know. I have no comments on this. Unto you is born a son. This, I think you can make a good argument that this is the climax of the story. It begins with Naomi being stripped of children and grandchildren, with Naomi being stripped of a future. And where we reach, the point that we reach at the end of the story is all of that has come back to her. Remember too that Ruth was married. Isn't this interesting? Ruth was married for 10 years with no children. And now, as she and Boaz consummate their relationship, they're given a child almost instantly. Isn't that interesting? Yeah, you think about these two women who have known so much heartache and despair. Is there a greater sign of hope than a newborn child? And this is what they're given. It turns out that God has not forgotten Naomi, but has remembered her in the most profound of ways. We got a couple more verses. We'll finish up, and then a couple concluding comments. The women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. And they named him Obed, and he became the father of Jesse. the father of David. And then it rehearses the names that I just listed to you. So, two things. You remember when Naomi and Ruth came back to Bethlehem? The women of the community gathered around and said, "Is that Naomi?" And Naomi says, "Don't call me sweet. Don't call me pleasant. I am bitter." The whole story's been reversed again. I think one of the central themes of this book, one of the central key learnings that we see in this book and testimonies of this book is that Naomi thought she had been abandoned. And it turns out anything but that was true. And the means of her redemption was not the miraculous provision of food. It wasn't the miraculous appearance of an angel. The means of her redemption were the people around her doing what God had asked them to do. And the fruit of that, it turns out, is the birth of a man named David, to whom a promise is made that one of his sons would establish an eternal throne. 2 Samuel 7. How many times we come back to that passage? So the story of Ruth isn't accidental. The story of Ruth isn't just a quaint, nice story about a nice man named Boaz. It's a story, a powerful story of God's redemptive work through his people, which secures not only the future of the people involved, but the future of the promise that has been made. Nothing short of God's promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob has been secured in the story of Ruth. And without her, there is no David. Also, think about this. What stories do you think King David grew up with? He grew up with the story of his great-great-grandmother and his great-grandmother and his great-grandfather. He grew up the story of Naomi and Ruth and Boaz. You think that didn't shape him? Think that didn't have something to do with the kind of man David became? You think the man after God's own heart wasn't formed by the story of Naomi's courage, Ruth's faithfulness, and Boaz's generosity? Oh, you bet he was. I think you can make a strong argument David's not David without Ruth, Naomi, and Boaz. Not only physically there's no David, but as a man, there's no David without their story. So the last thing I'll say is this. If you want to zoom out, I think you can zoom out 3 times on this story. The first zoom out is Boaz was already in place in the midst of Naomi's darkest suffering. When Naomi felt most alone, when she was sure that God had abandoned her, Boaz is already in place. The means of God's salvation was already there. Second zoom out, in the era of the judges is how this story began, right, in verse 1. In the midst of Israel's darkest days, the means of their deliverance was already in place, because the means of Israel's deliverance was the line of Boaz and Obed and Jesse and David. If the judges are Israel's darkest days, their deliverance was already in place even in that moment. Third zoom out. In the midst of the world's darkest days, the means of our deliverance is already in place. It turns out that there is no depths to which we can run or fall in which the means of God's deliverance is not already active in our lives. Brothers, this is the gospel in the Old Testament. Nothing short of it. You cannot make any other claim. It is the gospel in the Old Testament. It's the story of Jesus, prefigured. All right, here are your questions. Let's see. There we are. Our questions are simple today for Brian Stillwagon, who tends to struggle with my wordy questions. What are you walking away with? Got it? What do you know about God now? Is it pretty clear? Got it? Okay. What do you know about yourself after hearing Ruth? What do you know about how we're called to show up in the world? Pretty straightforward with you in mind, sir. And break.